let's get this going on July 3rd. Thank you. Thanks to everybody that came, or is here, actually, on this date of July 3rd in 1776. This certain guy named John Hancock was really practicing his signature so he could sign the Declaration of Independence. Did you guys know that there's 56 signatures on the Declaration? So that's a little fun fact you can throw out tomorrow when you're meeting with people. Just act like you've known that forever. It worked for him because now it's got a very beautiful cursive handwriting. Maybe we should bring cursive back to our schools because it is beautiful. You know, today's July the 3rd, tomorrow's July the 4th, and I want to introduce myself. I'm Phoebe Benziger. I'm one of the 4 forum facilitators. There's Kathy Heavers and Barbara Bynum, Judy Ann Files, who is not here, but we always give you the spiel. If there's something interesting that's going on in our community or around that you feel you would like to hear somebody talk about that, or that you feel the audience would be interested in, please let one of us know. We've got some great things scheduled for the next couple months, but we're already looking out into late in the year and the first of next year, so please let us know. Just before we get carried away with all of this, Paul, we're going to get carried away with you. There is a parade tomorrow downtown that starts on East Main and ends on North First. It starts at 10. Tonight at Cerise Park, there's Soaring Over Colorado, the Air Force Band concert sponsored by Welcome Home Alliance. If you haven't been to a concert down there, this is a great time to go on a great night. You'll hear some wonderful music. And then again tomorrow down at Cerise Park, there's the 4th of July celebration in the park, live music, food, beer garden, family, fireworks, everything you might possibly want your 4th of July to look like. So today's speaker is my friend Paul Zaenger. He is a retired supervisory park ranger from Black Canyon. He's been retired for 2.5 years. He's still trying to work out this retirement thing. He's semi-successful at that, I would say. He's been in Montrose since 1993, so that's 31 years. They moved from California, he and his wife Nancy, she worked in law enforcement out in California, so that was a good move for her. So she now does some substitute teaching. She heads up Ignite. So not only is the Montrose United Methodist Church a hub and a stay, so are the Zaengers. So I am pleased to introduce my friend Paul, who's going to talk about the history and the renovation of the church. And as always, we welcome questions, but please hold them till the very end so that I can bring you the microphone and you can ask it through the microphone and everybody can hear your questions. So let's give Paul a big round of applause.
Thank you, Phoebe, and good morning. It's been quite a few years since I've been at the Wednesday morning forum, and I very much appreciate and enjoy coming to visit with all of you and the Montrose community in general. I would like to introduce a couple of people. Kelvin Kent and Steve Gray and Kathy DeVore are part of the team that is seeking to try and undergird the restoration of this building. And it's a really cool building. You're probably familiar with it, but I do have a lot of photographs as well. And I'll have questions, excuse me. I'll have questions at the end of this, and I promise it will not last 3 or 4 hours as originally intended. The story goes, in 1882, in the summer of 1882, that there were 3 women who were part of the United Methodist denomination, the Methodist tradition, that were looking to create or to establish a religious service, and they found a carpenter shop that was in Montrose. It was maybe not quite as nicely presented as in the painting here by Bob DiGiulio. But they on Saturday evening they brought or moved around some of the tools and equipment within the carpenter's shop, and set up some barrels for seating, and the following morning they had a worship service in Montrose, and that was the beginning of the Methodist Church here in town. Bob DiGiulio captured that scene. You can see Storm King in the background and so forth. This is a very traditional, if you're familiar with his art, it's a very traditional type of piece by him, commissioned about 25 years ago. Montrose started growing rather quickly in the 1880s and 1890s. By 1900, it had brick buildings even instead of just log or wooden structures, which is a sign of permanence on the frontier of western Colorado. The Methodists had built a church of their own then, a regular building, in 1886. By 1900, it had been there for a little while. It was located on Cascade and North 2nd Street on the corner there. Brick building, but it had a problem, like many of our buildings in Montrose, or really from Cortez north through here on up north to Grand Junction and out into Utah. Wherever you have these kinds of soils, it's geologically called the Manco Shale. Wherever you have these geologic soils, buildings often have shifting foundations, and that's at the crux of the problem with this building, which was eventually torn down, and the current Methodist building. In steps this interesting man, J.F. Wilson. I should say a big thanks to the Montrose County Historical Society, because they provided a bit of information along with the church's archives. But J.F. Wilson was an entrepreneur in town. His building is the more famous one on the corner of Main and Cascade on the north side, across from the old Daily Bread building. Wilson had formed a partnership with John Kyle, who was a farmer rancher out on Spring Creek Mesa. And Wilson actually owned some property. In fact, he owned 4 lots right on the corner of Park and South 1st Street. He was a supporter of a lot of causes, a lot of things in Montrose at the time. And in 1909, he sold those 4 lots to the Methodist Church so that they would be able to build a new building in a new location, and hopefully with a different foundation. He actually, in 1909, there were a lot of things going on. I'll come back to that in a second, but he actually, and this is not an unusual thing before antibiotics, but he died just a few years after he sold those 4 lots. He sold it for $1,600, $1,600. That would translate into about $54,000 today. So maybe still a good bargain. In 1909, the Gunnison Tunnel opening occurred in September. President William Howard Taft came through on the train and pressed a bell or a buzzer, and the waters flowed through the tunnel, and there was a big celebration and everything else. It's hard to picture how much of an impact that had on the community at that time. There, almost at that time, there grew a building boom of structures and economic activity in Montrose that was really, I wouldn't say surprising, but maybe a little bit unexpected. At the heart of some of that was the Potato Growers building, and that's the one across the tracks on Main Street that Dave Fishering has been working on restoring. The Potato Growers, and he's done quite a bit of research on this building. The Potato Growers were farmers before the co-op concept had arrived in Montrose. But in his take, there was a lot of commerce that went through that building. A lot of economic activity just by them building that in 1909. Not just potatoes, but apples and lots of other produce that moved through that right there by the tracks, and from there out to the rest of the world by train. Also, you'll probably be aware of this, that in 1909, it actually says so, it's a little hard to see in that picture, but up on the top, the KP building, the Knights of Pythias building, they were a philanthropic organization in Montrose at the time, and that building was also constructed along with a number of others in town. So Montrose was really growing simply because the Gunnison Tunnel, which not all of the lands were being irrigated quite right away in 1909, and in fact it wasn't until a few years after that that there was quite a bit more going in terms of irrigation once the tunnel was completed. The people of the church, of the Methodist Church, had a choice to make on what they wanted their building to look like now that they had the property. In those days, and even today, most church buildings were on a kind of rectangular basis. This is the upstairs, this is the downstairs. This is from St. Peter's Church in Philadelphia. It's just a pretty stock kind of drawing. You can find dozens of these if you do a search on historic buildings from that time. But that was not necessarily what they were looking for here in Montrose. What they were looking for was actually somewhat different. And so they contacted an architect out of Colorado Springs, Thomas Barber, who actually did a couple of things that were different and included the Akron plan. The Akron plan, if you go back into the old movie archives and look for the movie Elmer Gantry, which is about an evangelism, and there's this revival in the couple of decades following the Civil War in the 1880s. And that was part of the Akron plan out of Akron, Ohio, where you had your church portion here and your Sunday school or educational portion here. And there was a movable dividing wall between them so that young people, children, could have an educational period during part of the church service that was going on over here. The wall would be up during the opening part, closed during the educational part, and then open again at the end of the educational part where they would all be together. It does make me wonder how long those services went, if they had that much. Anyway, Barber had created this design not on the very rectangular aspect, but oriented it so that the stage or the platform or the altar was up in the corner. This was actually quite not entirely unique, but a really significant change in the design, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The Akron plan was really intended for community, and often that educational part is really important in the 1800s and early 1900s. And a lot of the reason for that was that there didn't exist at the time child labor laws. Now, there are different viewpoints on childhood education in the 1800s, later 1800s and early 1900s, but only about 50% of the children in those days actually went to some schooling. It varies from state to state, depends on which researcher you're looking at. So Sunday school was not necessarily about religious instruction, it was maybe just about reading and writing as well. And also perhaps about arithmetic and other parts of their education, which is kind of an interesting aspect of this. So in the interior of the church, and some of you have probably seen that, you can see that there's a wall that's coming this way and a wall that's going that way, and that's because the platform or stage is set in the corner. This is where the wall was located. That would be raised and lowered over those two floors, and the rooms would be in the back. But that was altered not very long after the building was completed, and they put in, they changed the rooms around and redid some of the interior at that time. Barber actually also created designs and drawings. This is one of those drawings that exist. And it is essentially is pretty faithful to that. He was here in 1909, and he estimated that it would cost the congregation about $30,000 to build the building. We'll see that was not entirely right on when we get to the end of that. Some of the women actually, after 1909, used this and created this into a postcard and mailed it out to people in the community. And they invited them to the Knights of Pythias building for a potluck kind of dinner in order to start finding funds to build the structure. Well, they did actually get to that. The foundation they started building that in 1912. And they had hand-hewn, rough-hewn, and hand-hewn blocks, and then more cinder-type blocks going down below that as less decorative, probably more affordable. And they continued working on that until 1915, when they put a roof over it. There were evidently no interior walls that had been constructed in the basement, but they were using the basement then for all kinds of activities. And we'll see where that kind of evolves as we go through the construction period of time. The stonemasons on this were typical of the time period. They earned about $7 a day. I think at one point they were petitioning the contractor for $8 a day. But their names are not entirely unusual in the community. There's Champion, the last name of Champion, Archer, Smith, John Smith, his wife delivered their first child during this time period when they were laying the stones on the Methodist Church. This is a picture where these same people are quarrying the same stone that's over at the courthouse. Valencia is another name, and so on, how these folks are actually really integrated into the community. Like J.F. Wilson, community was really important, coming together to build the city of Montrose. Then World War I came along. In 1914, war erupted in Europe, and that created some problems for them. And as they finished the foundation, they started recruiting and raising more funding for building the building. But they found that there were supply chain problems because a lot of material was going into the war effort, even though the U.S. had not entered the war. The U.S. actually did come into the war in 1917 when they had ordered the cornerstone of the building. This is on, kind of faces the corner of South Park and South First. They took one interesting thing about it is they took the materials from the old cornerstone from that original building and added some additional material and put them into this cornerstone. So there's stuff in there. It's just getting access to it would probably be pretty impossible. So an interesting thing up here, the third row down from the top, you can see that they had turned the bricks as a bit of a motif. When they started actually, the first wall that they started erecting on the structure was on the north side, on the alley side, and you can kind of see that every sixth row is one of those sets of stones that are turned on their side. There's some other interesting nuances in the exterior of the building like that. One of those is the windows. The steel came into short supply in 1917. The United States declared war on Germany in 1917 in the spring of that year. By late summer, when they started raising this wall, they couldn't get steel for the frame on the windows. So when you look at the windows, what they did was they just built arches there, even though the intent was for the windows to be square, and the windows, of course, are square, and they framed them in with wood in order to make that happen. They got far enough along, and they ran out of money. It was a pay-as-you-go kind of thing. So down in the basement, they started an activity once a year that they had these state dinners. The state dinners were a setup where you would call to make a reservation, and dinner would be provided, but you would not sit at the table with your family. You would sit at the table from the state in which you were born. So if you were from Missouri, you would sit at the Missouri table. If you were from Michigan, the Michigan table. You might sit at the Tennessee table or the New York table or one of those other tables. And then you would visit about that. There would be a master's ceremony who would then who would then organize the rest of the activities, which would be music. There would be some soloists. There would be some readings. One of these state dinners happened around President's Day, and they had patriotic readings and lots of red, white, and blue, similar to what we would do over that holiday or the 4th of July. And then there would be a toast. The Toastmaster would call on the table, and somebody from each of those tables would raise a glass of some sort or another, and extol the virtues and values of that state. The first Toastmaster was Frank Catlin, excuse me, F.D. Catlin, who was an attorney in town, very, very instrumental in a lot of the growth, a lot of the activity. If you do a search through some of the Montrose materials about historical people, he'll show up. He was quite instrumental in that, very community-minded. He wanted to participate in this because the auditorium size of the new building would make a big difference for the people of Montrose. But subsequently, not only him, John Bell, John Bell, who was a congressman in the early 1900s from Montrose, was Master of Ceremonies. Pretty instrumental in that he was the one who was one of the co-sponsors of the irrigation bill that funded and established the Gunnison Tunnel and the Uncompahgre project. In addition to that, Tony Manel was one of these characters. They had 4 of these state dinners over the course of time. Tony Manel, Townsend Manel, was the county clerk for decades in Montrose, and was also a big participant in community life and believed in community. And his brother, Ira Manel. Ira Manel was on the building committee for building the church, essentially, for getting the job done. But Ira was also as a secretary of the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association. Those are the people that manage the water and manage the Gunnison Tunnel and bring prosperity through agriculture into the community. Ira was born in Montrose. Actually, no, he wasn't born in Montrose, but he and his brothers moved to Montrose in the early 1800s when he was still pretty little, and was very community-minded. Really made a lot of things happen through the water users, and it could be argued that some of his actions really helped to make the Gunnison Tunnel happen. Without him, maybe it would still probably have happened, and some historians would argue that, but by his actions, it made it a lot easier for the tunnel to come about. And so they continued to work through 1918, and in fact, what they were successful doing later in the summer of 1918, the United States has soldiers in Europe. The largest land battle that the U.S. Army has ever fought in the Argonne forest of northern France and parts of Belgium was a big success that fall. And in that fall, they start raising all of the rest of the walls that had not yet been finished. In the late summer, in late July and early August, they finished the roof, and by September, the dome is completed. And so they have the superstructure. Essentially, the shell of the building is completed by the end of 1918, and then 2 things happen. One is they run out of money. The second piece is that the end of the war comes. That's on what we today call Veterans Day, November 11th. But there's a flu or a pandemic that comes in behind that, and as soldiers come home from the war, the flu comes with them, the Spanish flu, a pandemic not terribly different from the way COVID unfolded. And in the basement of the church was offered, and they set up a hospital for the flu patients that would be there. Maybe their stay wasn't terribly long, maybe only a week. For some, they probably stayed there for quite a while. And then the famous Mayo Clinic was established only out of Minnesota in those days, had developed an inoculation, or what we would today call a vaccine. You could schedule that with the city, but you would have it administered to you in the basement of the church, because that was a big open enough space for that to take place. And it halted construction as well, in part because this was, as we remember from COVID, a lot of things changed with that pandemic. But the carpenter team, under the name of A.L. Brown, the carpenters come in because the interior of the building is completely unfinished above the basement floor, above that level. And so they have to build stairs, they have to build floors, they have to build walls, they have to build the balcony that's in there, and many other things that have to be constructed by these carpenters that come in. Again, laborers, very similar in town to those who were the stonemasons, the masons that were setting that up. And by the end of 1919, with a great big push, the building is essentially finished. We'll get to some of the details in a minute, but it's essentially completed as we see it today. They actually do have church services in January of 1920. One of those, sadly enough, was Ira Manell's funeral. They had a service for him and his family in January. He had contracted cancer, which was, it's not entirely understood today. It was poorly understood in 1920, how cancer has an impact on us. There are a number of elements in the building. It is a Romanesque piece of architecture. By that, the crenellated or the zigzaggy pattern that's at the top of the towers contribute to that design. Some of these other motifs that are in the walls, and then the arched windows and doorways, which are predominant on the main facing street sides of Park and South First, are what contribute to that Romanesque style of architecture. But there are a few other elements that are unique, actually, to the building, and unique somewhat in Montrose as well. Among those is the bell tower. There is a bell up there. It's actually a pretty interesting one, and you can study up a little bit if you're inclined to have a ringing bit of knowledge about such things. The bell was forged in Northville, Michigan, and that's outside of Detroit. And on the yoke of the bell, you can start finding out a little bit more information. By its size, the bell is probably around 400 pounds in weight. It's predominantly forged of copper, but it's an alloy with tin. So between the two elements, that's how it comes about. It's from the American Bell Foundry. It's number 42, which is one of the last numbers in the sequence of the forging of that. And so it's presumed that it's hard to really tell because the records don't seem to be available, at least not online, that the bell was actually probably forged about 1919 and then brought to Montrose. And it kind of begs the question, how did they get it up there? 400 pounds. There would have been electric motors that could have been used at the time in large cities, Chicago, New York, and whatever. They would have had electric motors. Electricity by 1920 was a going concern, and they could have used maybe a crane with a few pulleys in order to raise that. The records that we have are silent on how that came about, but about that time, they did have a crane. They were building a grain elevator over by the river, and there's a photograph at the Historic Society of that. So it's hard to know. They probably used scaffolding of some sort or another to raise it up, and if they used human and maybe horsepower, there would have been a lot of grunting to get it up there. But one way or another, they got it up there. There is a carillon that also rings out at noon and at other hours of the day. But that is an electronic device with speakers, and it's not the same as the free ringing bell, which actually can still be in use. So down at the bottom by the front door, you pull on the rope here, the rope goes up through a couple of rooms that are below the bell. The rope comes up into the wheel, which is anchored. You can see the rope up at the top of the photo there, anchored to the yoke, and when the wheel spins this way as you pull down, the bell tips and it rings out. It's actually a really nice sound, and they calibrated the tone of the bell based on the mixture of copper and tin. The clapper has been replaced. It was replaced about 10 years ago. because it was anchored. The anchoring of it inside of the bell seemed to be coming apart, seemed to be deteriorating. The church does still have the old clapper, but that is a replacement clapper that I suppose if you go to bell businesses, you can get a new clapper. Windows. The windows are also pretty emblematic of the building. Stained glass windows. There are stained glass windows throughout. There is clear glass that is on the exterior of these windows, so particularly on the north side where the offices are, the windows, the stained glass portion can be raised and just natural light can come in. But they do lend a certain air and characteristic to the building. There are 4 large windows where the glass is actually painted. They're decorative windows with scenes. This is Christ and the Good Shepherd. There are, and then surrounding that are the glass pieces that are actually where the glass has been dyed. A dye has been added to the glass in its manufacturing that bring that out. One of those is another interesting window. It's a circular window. This piece here has been growing that hole, and that piece of glass has been coming apart, and it clearly needs some restoration. That's not in the immediate work to be done right now. And it also kind of leaves you wondering, glass can be kind of heavy. And it does kind of make you wonder, well, how much does that window weigh? And that's also up probably 30 or 40 feet above the concrete pad that's behind on the back side of the church. That's the east-facing front. And how did they get that window up there? And probably in a similar way. Again, it's not really recorded. The local paper just says the stained glass windows were brought in 1920 and installed. So they're probably using clear glass windows at the time. There are stained glass restoration companies. One is on the Front Range, one is in Wisconsin, and they would use electric motors to be able to access the windows. And when you do a quick look at those websites, they would actually take the window out and then take it to their building or their factory on the Front Range and restore the windows that way. And then there's another item in here that you can't really see. You can see what creates it, and that's the acoustics inside in the hall. So I mentioned before there's a wall going this way and a wall that comes out this way, kind of straight towards us, in this two-story plus auditorium. And in addition to that, there are a couple of other features that create essentially an acoustic bullhorn. So the floor slopes downward. You can kind of see by the seats there that slope downward towards the front. Then you've got kind of this, like I say, just kind of almost like a bullhorn that is accentuated by 2 other things. One of those is the wraparound balcony. So it's creating this space, almost like a 3-dimensional oval that is capped, in fact, by the dome. So the acoustics in there are an old-fashioned style of trying to enhance the music or the speaking, whatever is the sound that's to be done in there. Whether it could be instrumental, it could be vocal, it could be speaking just straight words, in order so that there isn't a bad seat in the house to be able to listen to what's being presented. One of the things that's presented in this is, in fact, the old pipe organ. Well, it's not so old now as much, but this is a very early day photo of the pipe organ. And if you look closely at it, it's a little hard to see because of the old-fashioned photo. But these are not decorative pipes as are existing there today, and I'll show you a picture in just a minute. There are, and you might be able to see them, there are more pipes behind this because this wall, this lower wall, sticks out farther than the way that the wall protrudes today. And you can see that in part because there's a door right here, and this is very close to the door. So there were a lot of pipes that were back there that are really hard to see in that picture, but that's how it was originally configured. And in fact, you can see that there are 2 galleries that were created on either side up here, and we'll see that actually in a minute, but they didn't put those galleries in until much more recently. Today, you have the same kind of configuration, but there's a lot more space in here. You've got the set of chimes that were added in about 1990. And you can see that there's a little hinge here, and these doors, which are still part of this, were at the access points in order for the blowers to access the blowers as well as the electronics back behind it. And then the console is sitting on the right, which is what kind of makes everything happen by the organist. That's got to be a really hard job to play an organ. This is not quite as elaborate as some of the great cathedrals. It does have 3 keyboards. There are 2 up there for hands, and then there's another keyboard down here that are for the foot pedals. There are 32 pedals down here. There are 61 of the keyboard there. A standard piano has 88 keys. So and I'll get to that in a minute as to why there are only 61 keys that are there, both sharps and flats, as well as the regular white keys. The tabs up above that, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I do want to point out these pedals. These are very important. I'll get to that in a minute. Up in the galleries, there are 9 different ranks of pipes, a total of 542 pipes. That seems like probably enough, but 9 ranks. A rank is one set of tones, so that could be a flute, or an oboe, or a trumpet, or a bass. Could be a part of that, of all of those 9 ranks that are played. And they come in various sizes and shapes that are particularly interesting. And the organist down below can set the instrument based on the tabs that they play. The original piece was done by the Kimball Company out of Chicago. And a traveling salesman came through in 1919, and the church got on board with the idea of a pipe organ. These would be called the stops, but instead of buttons, there are these tabs. So when you pull out all the stops, essentially, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have high volume. I'll get to that in a second. It means that you're pulling out all of the instruments. So the whole orchestra is going to be playing by the organist when you pull out all of the stops. What makes the volume, and this is interesting, I've come to learn some of this really recently, are those pedals that are down on the floor, just the push pedals, not the keyboard pedals, but those black foot pedals. When you press that, that is the swell. And that's what adds in more of the pipes in order to add volume. So these wooden pipes, you can see F, E, D, and so forth. The wooden pipes are what make the building vibrate a little bit when the volume is raised to such a level that it is like, blowing everything out the windows kind of thing. The organ does actually have that capacity to be very loud. Even though it's not a particularly large organ, you can find larger organs around Colorado and around the US and the world. But it is unique in Montrose in the fact that it is the only pipe organ, as far as we know, in town. It's not the only one on the western slope. There are a couple down in Durango. There's one up in Delta, a couple in Cedar Ridge, I guess. Grand Junction has quite a few, probably at least 3 on the campus of CMU up there. And there's one in Aspen and probably others. Those are just the ones that I know about. But it is a treat to have, I think, to have a pipe organ in the community, because it brings out a sound that is unusual, and it's not one that is easy to get to. So all of that comes about, and the church has a dedication in January of 1921. The organ is not yet completely installed. That happens later in 1921, but the stained glass, the bell, everything else is, we pretty much see it today. And they go through the decades, the 1930s, the 1940s, 50s. You don't need me to enumerate all the decades, but after 100 years, the problems start piling up, right? Just like at our houses. Cracks have come and gone. They've materialized. And then been plastered over, and generally that seems to have worked. But a few years ago, we were in COVID, and one crack in particular showed up in one of the stairwells, one of the historic stairwells, and it was really troubling. And we started seeing some other problems down in the basement. There was a cracked floor it was heaved up, and that was a little bit of concern. And so we started asking questions. People got together and looked at who do we know or who do we not know, and how can we get answers to some of these questions. So a firm, an engineering firm, was contacted, and they started doing an in-depth study. Their report is like a few hundred pages. Lots of pictures, though. And some of these pictures show some cracks, some of the exterior cracks. I mean, some of the cracks go right through some of the bricks on the exterior. They found cracks that were unknown, problems that were really a part of this. And they pinpointed this back to the fact that the foundation was shifting. So the plan was that you need to shore up the foundation, which is what has started. So there are 3 pieces of the project right now, referred to as phase 1. One is around on the backside, and I'll have some photos of that, but around on the backside is clearing away the alley, the asphalt that's in the alley, and some of the other pavement that's back there, because that's the corner that seems to be the one that's shifting the most, and then creating or setting in micro piles that will help shore up the foundation. I'll come back to that in just a second. The second piece is to stop the water infiltration that's going around the side and the exterior of the building. There are some places where when we get a big snowstorm, the water will pool up in some of these little areas that are around in between the staircases, the exterior staircases. And then the third thing, which is kind of exciting too, and much more visibly, it'll be much more visible, is to tuck point or repoint the mortar and replace bricks, and maybe do a little bit of cleaning on some of the bricks all the way around the whole building. So what does that mean, doing some micro piles into that? Well, the first thing that they did, and the city is a partner in this, is these are called valley pans for moving water, surface water, away towards the sewer system that will direct big thunderstorms and rainwater. We've seen that recently in the past couple of weeks. Move that water away to the pipes that will drain the rainwater out to the river. And so this piece is done. This is goes up to Main Street, and the building here on the right is the Montrose Center for the Arts. And so that piece is completed, but there is more to be done. And this is the corner. That the big circular stained glass window is right over here. This is the corner with the alley over here, and this is the old coal bin. The choice that they had was to either put those micro piles. Let me back up. A micro pile is essentially a steel bar that's a foot or 2 wide in diameter, and they will drill it and pound it down along the side of the foundation. They can do that on the exterior of the building, around each side of that corner, or you could do it on the inside, which would be more complicated, and they'd have to be more careful about some of the historic fabric inside the building. So what it was determined was it would be easier to remove the coal bin, which isn't used. It's an HVAC system for heating and cooling the building, but remove the coal bin and put them there. So they've done some test pits, and this week the intent is to start doing that. So they will drive them down to as close to bedrock as we can find in the Uncompahgre Valley, which means they'll go down about 50 or 60 feet, and then anchoring those to the foundation. One historical architect in town, that's John Horn, retired from the Alpine Archaeological Consultants, has said that in the buildings where this has been done, not necessarily only in Montrose, but in the historical buildings where this has been done, it stops the movement. So there's a great deal of guarded optimism that this will work very well, and it'll shore up the building at least for another 100 years. And so they had been doing some testing in these test pits, and the coal bin is probably removed, I'm guessing, and they'll probably take a break after today because there's a holiday, right? Yay! That'll be terrific. So that's all working in this. Locally, this is the people here, the building, refer to this as the quad. I'm not entirely sure why that's called that, but you can kind of see the circular window is up there at the top, and this is the back area for that. Afterwards, after all of that is done, then they will come in and they'll have to remove a lot of this stuff. I don't know that the trees will be taken out. I don't know that. They may be able to keep those, but they'll remove all of this. And then later on in July and into August, and the project will go until the end of September, at least it's intended to go that far. They will erect scaffolding around the building, and we'll be able to see modern day bricklayers, masons, repointing the mortar and replacing broken bricks and restoring the structure on the exterior. It's really pretty cool. The cost of that, I should say the cost of the original building was actually $65,000. In 1920, the local paper had said, yep, $65,000. So it was double what they had anticipated. We're hoping that we have pretty secure figures. But the phase one, which is all the work I just described, is $1.2 million. The additional stuff for the total restoration, which includes some accessibility questions that need to be managed or handled so that people can get in and out of the building more easily, the windows and a number of other smaller projects, but still somewhat expensive, would go above that. So far, the amount that's been raised is close to $600,000. And that's all primarily just within the people of the Methodist Church that have raised that money. Grants have been applied for, and there are more in the future. We've been unsuccessful in realizing grants, but tax credits, or a tax credit has also been applied for, but no response yet on that. So it's quite an undertaking. And for those of you who know me, there's always that, okay, so what? Why do I care? That's always the question that I kind of want to get at. And there are some particulars about that. And let me just briefly share that, and then I can take questions as well. Partnerships. A lot of aid to the Montrose community flows through this building. 3,000 pounds of food in 2023 to Sharing Ministries. It's 1.5 tons of food to people in need in the Montrose community. That's a lot of food, 1.5 tons. When you figure that some of that is going to be like a box of pasta, boy, that's a lot of boxes of pasta. Or a can of baked beans. That's like 3,000 cans of baked beans, because each can is probably about a pound. 1,300 meals were served on Sundays, just on Sundays, in the basement of the church to people in need. Not necessarily homeless, but some people have a great need. They are able to manage their home, but as we know, in inflation, in an inflationary period, that has put a real crimp on people with fixed incomes in their budget. And so we've seen that continue, that need to continue every Sunday. That was instituted in 2016, and there have been many additional organizations that come into the basement of the church to provide for that Sunday meal. It's not just the Methodist Church that is doing that. Nearly 200 people meet 9 times per week for AA and NA. Addiction is a horrible thing. It's a really struggle, and it affects everybody in the family. And so this is really a need that is fulfilled. Even through COVID, they met in the basement of the church. And 250 backpacks of food were distributed in 2023 through KidsAid. It's a local organization. It's not part of the church, but they use that to bring materials and food in, pack the backpacks, and then it goes back out. And many of the people of the church do that distributing. But 250 kids get a backpack in the Montrose School District every Friday. 250. So that they don't go hungry over the course of the weekend. And they provide supplies like toothpaste, Band-Aids, or other things that children, grade school children, middle school children, would desperately need if they didn't have that backpack. There are a lot of other organizations, not necessarily just in 2023, but Shepherd's Hand, Dolphin House, Boys and Girls Club. But it's really fantastic to work with the Time to Dance Studio Symphony Chorus. They actually didn't participate in 2023, but they will be this coming winter. They will be doing their practicing in that acoustical sphere that's in the auditorium of the building. And Chapter, Colorado Archaeological Society, and more If there's a need, often one of the first places that community organizations come to is this building, is this place. Dave Fishering has spent quite a bit of time, and hopefully he'll be coming to the end of his project with the Montrose Potato Growers Association. I visited with him a few times over the past bunch of months, and actually back in the early '00s, I got to work with him. He was a park ranger up at Black Canyon. He's a remarkable individual. Grew up in town, graduated from Montrose High School, had a career in the military, and so on. He says that these buildings need to be occupied, all of these historical buildings, and there appears, that there is this wave that's been fostered a bit by the city of Montrose as it has become a certified local government under state law, which has really enhanced the care of historical buildings. He said, Dave Fishering says, these buildings need to be lived in, they need to be occupied, because that keeps them vibrant. That's what is the foundation of community. And I agree with him entirely, but I'd also like to add that along with that, these buildings there's maybe a little bit more at stake here than just the fact that we're restoring historical buildings so people can be in them. What's kind of at stake is the fact that people 100 years ago felt that building a community was really significant, that's how we live our lives, that we live our lives in relationships, and we use these buildings as the centerpiece of those relationships. In other words, that's where we come together. That's where we come together to celebrate. It's where we come together to meet community needs. It's where we come together to help people. And these are perhaps the most prominent immediately today that are historical buildings. But we have a lot of historical buildings in the downtown area that are also restored, that are part of who we are, that are part of our relationships. And the way we live our relationships to people of the past, people that are very similar to us, is by the protection and the care of these historic buildings. It's pretty crucial because in 100 years, I'm guessing none of us are going to be here sitting in this room, if the room is here, 100 years from now. And those people will have to be mindful of those relationships that we share today, even as we're mindful of the relationships that the people 100 years ago also shared. People like Frank Catlin and Ira Manel and J.F. Wilson. So I have a booklet if you'd like to consider more information. If you'd like, there's a timeline in here about the church and its building, its historical nature. There's a lot of other information on that. If you'd like to be a part of history, the booklet is a way of bringing that out, of being a part of community and being a part of history through this particular historic renovation and its effort. Thank you very much for
Very, very good. You know what you should do is bring back those state dinners as a fundraiser.
People like to eat.
They like to eat, and that's
Yeah.
part of your history, and
Yeah.
you could actually extrapolate with
Yeah.
that.
Yep. It's been discussed.
Yeah. So, does anybody have any questions? Jim, I know you do. Yeah.
So we should be thankful that an organ sounds a lot better than bagpipes. But they kind of operate on the same principle. So what in the organ, what supplies the pressure?
There's a blower that's down in the basement, and then that brings the air up. And I'm assuming that's an electric motor on the blower. Yeah.
Hang on, Lloyd.
So what are the accessibility issues? I assume they didn't address accessibility, but they designed the building.
Right, the ramp that's there does need some repair, but also there's an elevator that is just flat out broken that's on the new wing. The new wing was added in 1993, was completed in 1993, and that elevator that needs to be resolved. I'm not sure that the intent is to replace the existing one with another one in that spot. There are a couple of choices that architects have suggested, but an elevator is probably the best ultimate resolution of that, and repairing the ramp.
what was the source of the exterior stonework that was used on the building?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't found anybody that can tell me the answer to that, so I'm still searching. I'm guessing it's up on the plateau, but I don't know that. I don't have a source for that. It'd be really cool to find out, because they would have hauled that probably by, they had gas-powered motors, and there were cars in town in 1910. There weren't very many cars in town in 1910, but I'm guessing they probably transported that by wagon. And there's actually a sheet that the church has that shows how much each individual was paid over the 2-week period, and some of those they talk about, they just hauled the stone from wherever the quarry was. It would have been really hard on your back.
So, Paul, do you have a number of how many stained glass windows are in this building?
Ooh, I don't know. Do you know? There are a lot. On that back side, there are, I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, probably around 6, and there are 2 stories of them, so there are probably 12 on the north side, on the alley side. But I don't know off the top of my head how many there are total. I know somebody who does, but I don't.
So on the cornerstone, it said it was laid in 1919?
1917.
1917, and then on the other side, it said organized?
1886.
1886,
Yeah.
so that's at the very beginnings of Montrose.
Yeah, that was when they built that first church, was 1886. So they were just recognizing those people 25 years before about their efforts, I think. Always good to know that we're not the first ones here, and that other people have wrestled with a lot of this stuff even as we do today.
Not to mention all the piano recitals.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can make even the worst piano player sound good at that. Last question.
Hey, Paul, Kelvin here. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. So, given that this building is without a doubt the architecturally most significant building in Montrose, and given that it is used a lot for other functions, for instance, I think early July the Valley Symphony Chorus will be playing here and do a wonderful job with the acoustics. Given that, but also given that it is a one particular denomination, the raising of funds is not easy. So could you just elaborate a little bit, what role does the Methodist Church play in helping the Methodist denomination, helping you, and how can we reach out to a broader community to support this fundraising to raise another 1.5 billion in order to sustain the viability of this wonderful building?
Yeah. The Methodist, without going into too much detail about how the church is organized, there is a conference office in Denver, and churches from Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah are a part of that conference. The conference has made available a low-interest loan and an interest-only loan. Who here has had a home project before? You don't actually have to raise your hand, but that happens. We all have that. And one of the concerns, as always, is a cash flow problem, is that you've got a contractor of one sort or another, just a repair individual who's going to come in and fix the bathroom, fix the kitchen, fix the roof. And cash flow can be a bit of a concern. So as we've been going through that, the church got a low interest, interest-only loan in order to help with that cash flow problem. The way that the community can become involved is to learn more, and we have the book here for you folks, for the folks here, but we've also been doing a lot of individual outreach to other community members and businesses and so forth. So everybody is welcome to participate in the historic preservation of the building, and every contribution, there is no contribution that's too small. If a child says, "Here's my $1," that is incredible, because they have participated in the care of this community, and I think that's really rich. It's really important that it is tax deductible if a child is paying taxes. Oh Lord. Anyway, good thing it's not April 15th. if a child is doing that. Their business expenses, there are a lot of different, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are a few different